Good day. The surreal G7 summit in Cornwall has been followed by equally surreal meetings between US President Joe Biden and the NATO leadership and the EU leadership in Brussels. I say surreal because it's difficult sometimes to get an entire grasp of what is going on as a result of these meetings. Vast, compendious communiques get published. One spends a long time trying to wade through them to get at the essence of what they say, and one comes away with the conclusion that in fact and in truth they are saying very little. It all looks very abstract, somehow theatrical, somehow not real, or as if it's more a performance, a stage play performed by uncertain actors to what is effectively and essentially an empty house. Well, let's first of all get to the NATO summit and let's look at this enormous and inordinately long communique that issued from it. Now, in advance of President Biden's visit to Europe, we were hearing a great deal from the United States about how President Biden wants to reconstitute NATO and the Western alliances, how he wants to strengthen them, to make them vibrant again after the allegedly chaotic era of Donald Trump, and how he wants to lead the NATO and Western powers in a great crusade to contain the League of Autocracies led by China and Russia. And we also heard a great deal, and there have been all kinds of commentaries about this in various foreign affairs magazines, and indeed hints about it from various figures within the US administration, that the plan is to try to detach ultimately Russia from China so that the US can focus on China and can thereby contain Chinese power, China being, of course, far and away the greatest adversary that the United States faces, with a manufacturing capacity greater than that of the United States itself, and with an economy that exceeds that of the United States in purchasing power parity terms, and which is likely set to overtake the United States in GDP, nominal GDP terms, probably at some point this decade. Well, that was what we were hearing. And we also learnt from an article in Washington Examiner that US officials were saying that at the summit meeting, which is due to take place on 16th June 2021 between President Biden and Putin, a summit meeting which will be published as this video which will be happening as this video goes up. The Biden administration, President Biden himself, would be telling Putin, in effect, either you join us in this great anti-Chinese crusade by breaking with China and by pushing back on China, or we will ramp up our threats and warnings and sanctions against you. But if you do as we wish, well, then we will pay you money from our great infrastructure program, which is nebulous and vague, and the sources of whose funds are completely unclear, but which, as I and my friend Alex Christoforou said in a recent Duran video we did on the topic, actually looks less like an infrastructure fund and more like a slush fund. Well, I will come to the Russian response to that in a moment. But what about NATO? How does the NATO communique reflect this agenda, this grand strategy, if you like, of trying to stabilize situation in Europe and focus instead on China? Well, if you actually go to the communique, you get the opposite impression. There's actually very little about China in it. This is the only reference to China which I could find. China's growing influence and international policies can present challenges that we need to address together as an alliance. We will engage China with a view to defending the security interests of the alliance. That's it. Now, there's an awful lot that follows about cyber, hybrid, and other asymmetric threats, disinformation campaigns, malicious use of ever more sophisticated, emerging and disruptive technologies, etc., etc. These sentences that say those things follow directly after the sentences relating to China. And a casual observer reading all those sentences together might conclude that all those comments about cyber, hybrid, and other asymmetric threats, disinformation campaigns, malicious use of ever more sophisticated, emerging and disruptive technologies somehow relates to China. But in fact, the various sentences, the ones that relate to China and which speak about China, and those sentences that talk about cyber, hybrid, and other asymmetric threats and all the rest, are what lawyers call a non sequitur. They do not follow. The first two sentences talk about how China's growing influence and international policies can present challenges that we need to address together, and that the NATO will engage China with a view to defending the security interests of the alliance. But the subsequent sentences about confronting cyber, hybrid, and other asymmetric threats and all the rest, though they might appear to be connected to those sentences about China, in fact are not. Do not do so. They do not say how exactly China is connected to the cyber, hybrid, and other asymmetric threats. They merely imply it. Now, why is this so? Is it in fact the case that all this talk about China being the great overarching adversary, this great rival, about the United States finding itself pitched against China in some great new Cold War, some great existential challenge that it's working out? Is it perhaps the case that none of that is really serious and it's not intentional? Well, I hardly think so. If you read and listen to things that the people connected close to the US administration are saying, then it's perfectly obvious, it is entirely clear that the US is indeed focused on China, almost to the extent of an exclusion of everything else. The reason there is only two sentences about China in this entire massive NATO communiqué, and the reason those two sentences are so bland, is the same reason that we for the tepid references to China in the communiqué that followed the G7 meeting in Cornwall. Bluntly and straightforwardly, the US's NATO allies in Europe are not interested or focused on a Cold War with China. China, as far as they are concerned, is far away. It is not a threat to them. It is not an existential challenge to them, as it is to the United States. They are not interested in it or in seeing it in those terms. Far from wanting the United States to settle the situation in Europe so that it can concentrate on China, they are worried instead that by focusing on China, the United States will lose interest in Europe and lose interest in them. Far from wanting the US to get itself involved in a confrontation, a Cold War with China, they would far rather prefer that the United States and China came to terms so that the United States could continue to focus on Europe and challenge that country, which some of them, not all of them, still see as the true enemy, which is, of course, Russia. And that is so is amply demonstrated by the NATO communiqué itself. the contrast between what it says about China and what it says about Russia is extraordinary. Whereas we had just 2 sentences about China, the comments about Russia go on for paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. There are, I think, between 5 and 6 of them. I've hardly counted, but they go on about all of Russia's extraordinary transgressions, its refusal to act in accordance with international law, or rather the new international order, its threats against its Ukraine, its use of aggressive and irresponsible nuclear rhetoric. I'm not quite sure what that means. Its development of its strategic forces. I mean, all of this at extraordinary and improbable length, showing where the real passion in NATO actually is. It's not against China at all. It remains against the old enemy, which is Russia. Now, I don't want to claim or pretend that every single NATO country thinks in this way. The Germans are very sceptical about this confrontation with Russia. They would rather see that it ended as quickly as possible. The French are openly critical. Macron has been making statement after clever statement about how this confrontation with Russia is going nowhere, about how the sanctions policy has failed, about how all this is misconceived and misguided. He makes all these clever statements, but of course, in the final analysis, he's not prepared to do anything. Because when it comes down to it, when these sort of statements are published, it is always and invariably the hardliners in NATO, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania to some extent, Britain definitely, that tend to win out and are able to get all this hardline rhetoric into communiques like this. So the result is that if the objective is to try to dial down tensions with Russia in Europe so as to focus on China, you end up with a communique that appears to say the opposite. But having said that, when you actually go further and analyse the statements, the comments about Russia, one thing becomes extremely clear, and that is that they are all rhetoric. And this is shown specifically and most importantly by the long, in fact, interminably long paragraph in which NATO discusses its support for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And of course, and above all, and primarily, Ukraine. Now, President Zelensky of Ukraine issued tweets and made comments as this NATO meeting was taking place, in which he implied, or in fact he didn't imply, he actually said that NATO had confirmed that Ukraine would be getting a NATO membership action plan and at this meeting, and that this would presumably be announced at this meeting. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is absolutely nothing in this document, in this NATO communique, about Ukraine getting a NATO membership action plan. And in fact, in the hours after Zelensky made those statements, President Biden came along and said that in fact the United States has not granted, and NATO has not granted, Ukraine a NATO membership action plan. Before such a thing can even be considered, Ukraine must carry out radical reforms to sort out corruption, improve its economy, and do all sorts of various unspecified things in order to make itself eligible. Of course, Biden, the other NATO leaders, and all the rest say all that about Ukraine needing to do all these things in the full and complete knowledge that none of those things will ever be done because they are beyond Ukraine's capacity to do. So in reality, even though NATO talks about its support for Ukraine and does so at inordinate and extraordinary length, in practice and in fact, it is offering Ukraine no support at all. And the contradictions on the Ukraine issue go even further. So, for example, we read, we are also stepping up our support to Ukraine. We call for the full implementation of the Minsk agreements by all sides and support the efforts of the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. Well, the two statements are in contradiction to each other because, as everybody in NATO knows, the only reason that the Minsk agreements are not being fulfilled is because Ukraine is not fulfilling them. It refuses to do that which the Minsk agreement of February 2015 clearly says it must do, which is open negotiations with the leaders of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. So NATO, at one and the same time, blames Russia for the conflict in Ukraine, says it will step up support for Ukraine, and demands that the Minsk agreement be fulfilled in the full knowledge that it is in fact Ukraine, not Russia, which is failing to fulfill the Minsk agreement. There is no logic, there is only contradiction, and it is all submerged in a sea of words. Well, what are the two great powers, China and Russia, going to make of all of this? What will the Chinese think? What will the Russians think? Well, we can talk about the Chinese, what they think, because they've been issuing strong comments about all the various allegations that have been made about them and about what has been said about them at the NATO summit meeting. So I'm going to read an article from Global Times, which is based upon a communiqué published by the Chinese mission to the European Union, and which sets out China's response. And this article reads as follows. China fired back on Tuesday over allegations against China from a communiqué released after the conclusion of the NATO summit, and warned that it would not sit back if any others pose systemic challenges to it, and it will closely watch NATO's strategic adjustments toward China. Responding to NATO leaders' tough statements on China, the Chinese mission spokesman said on Tuesday that China will not present systemic challenges to others. But NATO's claims have slandered China's peaceful development, misjudged the international situation and China's role, and continued the Cold War mentality mixed with group politics. NATO leaders said in the communiqué, released after the NATO meeting on Monday, that China's stated ambitions and assertive behaviour present systemic challenges to the rule-based international order and to areas relevant to alliance security. It also accused China of rapidly expanding its nuclear power and being opaque about nuclear modernisation. And the mission responds that China has always pursued a defensive national defence policy and has kept its military modernisation legitimate, open and transparent. In 2021, China's defence budget is $209 billion, accounting for 1.3% of the nation's GDP, which is less than NATO's 2% pass line. In contrast, the 30-member NATO alliance has a total military spending as high as 1.17 trillion, making up over half of the global sum and 5.6 times more than China. It is crystal clear to the world whose military bases stretch all over the world and whose aircraft carriers are wandering around to flex their military muscles. As for nuclear weapons, the number of nuclear weapons, warheads, amongst NATO members is nearly 20 times that of China, and China, moreover, has a commitment to a no first use principle of nuclear weapons at any time or under any circumstances. China has been committed to peaceful development, but will never forget the tragedy of the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, nor the sacrifice of our compatriots' homes and lives. We will unswervingly defend our sovereignty and development interests and keep a close eye on NATO's strategic adjustments and policies towards China. So, these attempts by some people to water down strong words against China in the communiqué have met with no favour from China. On the contrary, the Chinese can see very clearly what the US, at least, is about, and it's made it very clear that if the United States is in for a fight with China, it has got it, and if NATO is foolish enough to join in, well, it has got it too. So, nothing very much, no sign from China of any conciliatory rhetoric coming from there. What about Russia? How did the Russians respond to all of this? Well, we don't know what the Russians think about the communiqué itself because they haven't discussed it, but we did have an extremely long and very interesting and rather acrimonious, fiery even, interview from President Putin with NBC television. And of course, it touched on China. And we learn that Mr. Simmons, Keir Simmons, the interviewer, discussed the potential threat of China's rising military strength towards Russia. He talked about China's absence from the US-Russia nuclear arms control negotiations as if that would be a problem for Russia. He brought up, of course, China's behavior in Xinjiang, and he complained about Russia's cooperation in the space program with China and what would happen hypothetically if there were a war between China and the US or between China and over Taiwan. And Simmons then also tried to pique Putin by saying China, for example, abstained on Crimea at the Security Council. China's biggest banks have not contravened US sanctions against Russia. Do you think you get 100% support from China? So, how did Putin respond? He responded as follows. Can I be completely honest? We can see attempts at destroying the relationship between Russia and China. We can see that those attempts have been made in practical politics. And your questions too have to do with it. And then he went on to say at great length how good relations between China and Russia are. We have developed a strategic partnership relationship between Russia and China that previously had not been achieved in the history of our nations. A high level of trust and cooperation in all areas, in politics, in the economy, in the area of technology. And of course the Chinese responded and to all the things that Putin said. And we had comments from Zhao Liqian, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman. We highly appreciate President Putin's positive remarks on China-Russia relations. Indeed, China and Russia are united like a mountain, and our friendship is unbreakable. Sky is the limit for down-to-earth China-Russia cooperation, and we are full of confidence in the development of bilateral relations. The Russians can read communiques. They can hear statements. They can hear the kind of rude and aggressive questions that Keir Simmons addresses to President Putin. Why would they switch from an alliance with China, a de facto alliance with China, that has so strengthened their political, diplomatic, economic and military leadership, to a Western alliance that talks about them, in such an extraordinarily aggressive and disrespectful way. Ultimately, it makes no sense at all, and we can be sure that that is what President Putin is going to tell President Biden in Geneva. I'm going to finish this video by discussing an extraordinarily insightful article being written by Scott Ritter, who is, of course, a former US Marine officer and also a former US intelligence officer, and who writes about these questions of strategic balance in an exceptionally insightful and interesting and informative way. And he makes the point that the United States is increasingly playing from an extremely weak set of cards. It's doing so at a time when its own politics and its own economy are looking increasingly wobbly, and that's putting it generously, and when its NATO alliance is not only fractured, especially on the topic of China, but also, in military terms, increasingly tacky and unconvincing. Here is what Scott Ritter says. The rise of Putin coincided with America's strategic shift from a Eurocentric power focus to pursuing regional transformation fantasies in the Middle East and South Asia, seeking to use the US military as a vehicle for nation building in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. The 20-year experiment has failed, leaving the US fiscally and morally bankrupt, and its military in Europe a mere shadow of its former self in terms of capability and reach. Where in 1990 the US could deploy 4 divisions to Europe in 10 days, today it takes the US 4 months to deploy 1 brigade. The administration of George W. Bush initiated this process with a substantial assist from the Clinton administration, and the Obama-Biden administration sustained it. Whilst tactless and inept in his execution, Donald Trump was realistic regarding the situation he had inherited, seeking to repair relations with Russia whilst approaching the issue of NATO with a more realistic perspective born of fiscal and geopolitical reality. This approach incurred the wrath of the American establishment, resulting in a single-term presidency and the ascension of Joe Biden to his status as American Commander-in-Chief. Biden, however, has shown no real appreciation for the state of affairs he has inherited, formulating a foreign policy premised on the mantra of America is back without having any appreciation of what that back means. His rhetoric and posturing suggests that he believes the dominance and prestige America enjoyed in 1991 can be replicated today simply by willing it to be so. And then he makes the, I think, absolute killer point. The reality check that followed Biden's impolitic chest thumping manifest in the withdrawal of Russia's ambassador and the snap mobilization of 100,000 troops on Russia's border with Ukraine. That drove home the reality that the US and its NATO allies are not in any position to confront Russia in Europe militarily. More sober assessments coming out of both Europe and the US hold that it is the rise of China that represents a greater threat to the geopolitical positioning of the transatlantic partnership than Russia, but the NATO, in confronting this, is only able to project weakness. So there it is. Now, it has to be said, and Scott Ritter talks about this, that there's some talk about increasing NATO's response capability so that it can put together a $30 30 battalion combat force in 30 days. But again, as Scott Ritter points out, even if that were achieved, and it is almost inconceivable that it could be, that would still leave NATO facing a challenge, a military challenge from Russia, which dwarfs that capability, and which is moreover growing stronger all the time. So, in reality, when Biden goes to Geneva and meets with Putin, far from having a solid NATO at his back, he has a fracturing and crumbling one with allies like the Germans and the French, who are increasingly cynical and who are most unenthusiastic about his anti-China agenda. Well, I have to say this, it has something of the quality of Don Quixote, of an American Don Quixote, Joe Biden, coming to Geneva to tilt at the Russians with a wily, cynical European Sancho Panza at his side. A Sancho Panza that at some level knows the truth, but doesn't want to share it with the old man because it is not in his own interests to do so. Well, Don Quixote is going to be up against the man who is universally recognized as perhaps the world's most experienced statesman, and perhaps who, in terms of geopolitical chess, could be accurately called a grandmaster. That person is, of course, President Putin of Russia. It doesn't help that in preparing for this summit, it seems that President Biden has been taking advice from such discredited experts, or so-called experts, as Fiona Hill and Michael McFaul. I do wonder what is going to actually happen at this summit in Geneva. My guess is that the Russians, knowing all the truth, all the facts about the true hollowness and weakness of the US position, will listen quietly as the president drones on. They will string him along to the extent that they feel they need to, holding out a bait, perhaps, for some negotiations on strategic weapons. But, as I've said in previous videos, the real discussions are going to take place elsewhere, and one should expect, before very long, a trip by Vladimir Putin to Beijing. Thank you very much for joining me on this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and also on our main channel, The Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. And please also remember, by the way, to check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also remember to check us out on our new platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, SuperU and Locals. And if you feel you can, support us via Patreon, PayPal and Subscribestar. Also, don't forget to check out our shop and see the wonderful things we have there. Our famous magic mugs, our Duran hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies and all the rest. And please also join our Discord server. Lastly, don't forget to check your subscription to this channel and to press the like button if you like this video. Thank you for joining me for this program today, and have a wonderful day until we speak again.